All right, guys. I got my notes here. It's going to be a long one. All right, so we got a lot of stuff to go over today. Feel free to grab some popcorn, your favorite beverage, and we'll get into it. What's today's topic? Today's topic is exposure triangle. I know this is the one you've been waiting for all month, isn't it? So, what's an exposure triangle? Well, we're going to talk about how to get a good exposure with your digital camera. And the three main things that one has to adjust to create a good exposure. So number one, the aperture or lens opening. Number two, the shutter speed. And number three, we've got the camera sensor sensitivity. So adjusting the camera sensor, how sensitive you want it to be. So the fact is that all these modern digital cameras, they've got wonderful computers and they can get a great exposure by turning everything on auto. That's true. However, sometimes you want to do things specifically. So you want to get more depth of field, or you want to stop action, you want to, blur things specifically. And the camera doesn't always know that. So what someone needs to do is understand these three interconnected aspects to getting a good exposure. So, for example, let's say you wanted to show motion blur. We've got an example of a waterfall here. And the waterfall, you can see the rocks are nice and frozen, they're nice and sharp, they're in focus, but the water is blurry. And this shows that the water moved during the exposure. There we go. You get to show how an artistic way of showing motion. Or you want to stop action, like this picture here of a jet. The jet was going hundreds of miles an hour, and I was able to stop action with a higher shutter speed. Okay? So those are a couple of different things to think about when you're taking pictures. Now, you don't need a PhD or anything like that to understand all of this. However, you have to understand the basics of how these three interact together. So the first thing is the aperture. And the aperture or lens opening is in blue, and that's on the bottom. And then we have the shutter speed, which is in red on the right-hand side. And we have the ISO camera sensor sensitivity. Oof. And that's on the bottom. Okay. That's how sensitive you adjust your camera's sensor. Together, these three things will create the correct exposure. And this will give you the ability to create the kind of picture that tells the type of story that you want to tell in your photos. So, number one, we're going to go with the blue section, the aperture. Aperture is defined as an opening in a lens which light passes through. The mechanism will have many blades, and these blades are called a diaphragm. And the blades will move, creating a different size opening for the light to pass through the lens. In photography, the size of the lens opening is defined as f-stops. So an f-stop is a ratio. It tells you how much light comes in. For example, f4 has 2 times amount of light as f5.6. And f2.8, 2.8 has twice as much light as f4.0. All right, so now you're thinking to yourself, wait a minute. The numbers are going smaller, but it's letting in more light. That's right, it's counterintuitive because it's an inverse relationship. So the bigger the number, the less light that comes in. The smaller the number, the more light it comes in. All right, so this is something to keep in mind when you're creating pictures. Okay, so when you take a look at examples of the f-stops, like f2.0 f2.8, f4.0. These increments are whole f-stops. And some cameras, or many cameras, for example, mine, will let you delineate it even more into fractions of an f-stop. So for example, let's say we go f2.0, f2.2, f2.5, and then we get to f2.8. And then at f2.8, we go to f3.2, f3.5 to f4. And then at f4, we go to f4.5, and then f5.0, and then we get to f5.6. So these delineations are in third stop increments. And these are a way how you can minutely control how much light comes in through the lens. So for example, we have a picture of a flower. Now the ASA is the same and the shutter speed is the same, but the aperture is different. So I wanted to show you examples of how the aperture, okay, adjusts the overall quality of the image. All right, so the only thing that was changed was the aperture in those images. So we're going to set that aside, and we're going to move on to the red section, or the shutter speed. Now remember, shutter speed is a fraction of a second. Well, it could be whole seconds. For example, a lot of cameras go from 30 seconds to 1/4000th of a second. My Olympus, for example, goes up to 1/8000th of a second. Okay? So you might see numbers such as 1/30th, 1/60th, 1/125th, 1/250th of a second. And these are whole f-stops. Okay? Remember in Aperture we have f-stops? Well, this also talks about the same amount of light between those whole numbers, like f2.8, f4. So here's an example of a waterfall that was taken at 1/2000th of a second. So we have some frozen water. It looks like it's frozen in midair. And then we have 1/30th of a second and 1/10th of a second. So as you can see with these three images, this is an example of how shutter speed can stop action or create motion or a motion blur. So this can help motion. So for example, in the waterfall pictures, the rocks right next to the waterfall, they're completely frozen. They're in focus, they didn't move, camera didn't move, just the water moved. The last part is ISO, the green section, or the camera sensor sensitivity. All right. Once upon a time, ISO or ASA, and the ASA would stand for, in America, American Standards Association. And this is the way to delineate film across all manufacturers, how to have the same sensitivity, and it would be marked on the film. So in the film days, you'd purchase film at whatever sensitivity for whatever situation you needed. Okay? The modern digital camera has a camera sensitivity, and then you can adjust that sensitivity right on the camera. Some examples of these numbers are ISO 64 to ISO 25600. And some cameras even go higher than that. So the higher numbers mean the camera is more sensitive, meaning it needs less light. More sensitive equals less light. So when you increase the sensitivity of the sensor, you also increase the noise, or how grainy it looks. And I have an example here of 4 different ISO settings. So the aperture is the same, but to get the correct exposure, the shutter speed and the ISO fluctuated. They changed. Okay? So the important part is, I just mentioned the ISO changing and how it affects the image quality. So I wanted you to be aware of what you can come across with your particular situation. The more blotchy things become because of the higher sensitivity. Also, there's also a color shift. And I wanted you to take a look at this and notice the color shift in these pictures. The quality of the image has a direct correlation to the ISO setting. And if you can, use the lowest ISO setting that you can for the situation. And sometimes this means you're going to need a good tripod to make sure the camera is steady for maybe a slower shutter speed so you can keep the ISO setting low. In addition to creating a good image, there are also programs that will help you enhance the image. And these image manipulation programs, a lot of them have a lower noise reduction. So in other words, you can reduce the noise in the image just by having the image processed through these image processors. Now that we understand the three basic parts, and once again we have aperture, we have shutter speed, and we have ISO. I wanted to show you some examples of how the three fluctuate and interact with each other. So the first exposure we have is ISO 200, 1/60th at f4. Now this is equal to ISO 200, 1/125th at f2.8. So 125th lets in half the light, and to compensate for that, f2.8 lets in twice as much light. So this is how you get equal exposures with adjusting the numbers. So by letting in more light here and letting in less light there, this is how we create a similar exposure. And understanding these relationships, you can adjust the camera to what you need. So let's take a look at the second example. So the second example, we keep the f-stop the same, and that's at 2.8, but we change the ISO, and we change it from 200 to ISO 800. And therefore, the shutter speed goes from 1/160th of a second to 1/250th of a second. Okay? So for example, let's say you're inside and you have to turn your ISO up. Now you can't open up your lens anymore because the widest opening is f2.8. So now you can turn the sensitivity up to make sure you can stop action. Okay? You might get a little bit of noise, but remember, most cameras, even up to ASA 1600, have pretty good images overall. Okay? So when the shutter speed goes from 1/160th to 1/250th, now you can stop action. And if you're stopping action, okay, now you can get nice sharp pictures of maybe your daughter at her spelling bee contest, or your nephew at a night game playing Little League, okay? So another example of this inside, I was taking pictures of this dance event, and I was able to I had to turn up the ASA or ISO. I had to turn that up so I can increase the shutter speed so I can stop action, and this is the picture that resulted. Okay, so not only less light is needing, but you might get a little bit more noise. The most important thing is I want you to practice with your camera. Okay, so when you practice, you get to know the limitations of the camera and your lens and you, because that's the other part of the equation. How steady are you holding pictures? Yes, I know they have image stabilization, which helps. And in conclusion, so we've got examples of waterfall. All right, and this waterfall, what it does, it shows you how shutter speed can change things. Or we've got the jet, where you can stop action. Or we've got, trying to stop action inside, with the dancing. Okay. And the way we were able to stop action because we had to adjust the sensor sensitivity, the ISO. All right, so these are things that I want you to keep in mind. Do your own practicing. And if you like information like this, feel free to like and subscribe. Leave your comments below, and we will see you in the next one. Take care, guys.